certainly there are consumers in the survey that think that the biggest chunk of the increase in tariffs will be borne by foreign producers, but on average, actually, that's not the case. We really see quite stark in the data that people really think that prices of goods will increase, and not only actually of goods imported from countries that will actually face potentially higher tariffs, but also domestically produced goods.
Tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary. According to Donald Trump, the US president ran promising to increase duties on all imports, particularly those from China, Mexico, and Canada. Even before he took office, was that promise already affecting the US economy? Welcome to the Chicago Booth Review podcast, where we bring you groundbreaking academic research in a clear and straightforward way. I'm Hal Weitzman. Today, we're launching a new series about Trumponomics. We're going to give you the Chicago Booth Review perspective on the White House's economic policies, starting with tariffs. Chicago Booth's Michael Weber has conducted research that documents how consumers have for months been shopping in anticipation of tariffs being put in place. Our conversation was recorded last week, after the Trump administration had implemented and then quickly rescinded tariffs on Colombia, but before they threatened to implement tariffs on Mexico and Canada, before putting those on pause, and before they got into a tit-for-tat tariff feud with China. Most economists agree that tariffs effectively act as a sales tax, raising prices for imports and for goods produced domestically. Consumers seem to agree and have been hoarding goods, behavior that looks set to raise inflation and set the Trump administration on a collision course with the Federal Reserve. Michael Weber, welcome to the Chicago Booth Review podcast.
Thanks a lot for having me. Great being here.
So we had to have you on because your most recent research is about tariffs, which is, of course, as we know, Donald Trump's favorite word, apparently. And, I wanted to start by asking you that political analysts say that at least some of the tariff talk is bluster or signaling and negotiation. And, of course, the first actual tariff that was put in place by the Trump administration was against Colombia for refusing to accept deportees, and it worked, I guess, and Colombia quickly relented and changed its path. But it sounds from your research like consumers are taking it seriously and they're changing their behavior accordingly. So just tell us, what is the sort of top-line finding?
Yeah, no, totally. So, I definitely can see that especially if you look at the previous Trump presidency, that, the announcement of future tariffs was used as a negotiation tool to extract rents from our trading partners. I would be a little bit cautious and maybe extrapolating too much from the previous experience, given that, in the first week we've seen that Trump 47 is already quite different from Trump 45 in the sense that, it's still possible that on Saturday we might see, in fact, tariffs increased on our biggest trading partners, Mexico and Canada. And at least through the lens of our consumer survey, we do see that many Americans expect that actually we'll see substantial increases in tariffs across the board, with the highest expected increase for goods imported from China, but also goods imported from Europe, Mexico, Canada, and actually around the world are expected to increase through the lens of consumer surveys.
Mm-hmm. So consumers at least seem to be taking it seriously. They're braced for it. They don't think it's just a negotiating move that will then secure some political end or, eventually lower trade, maybe lower tariffs.
No, totally. So in our survey, we actually did find that consumers expect the tariffs to be around 35% across the board, with the largest increase to happen for goods from China. So in that sense, consumers think it will happen. I guess as we'll discuss in a bit, they also already took actions to partially shield against the consequences they're expecting.
Yeah, and those increases that you're talking about, 35%, that's more than has actually been touted, right? What's actually been talked about is 25%, right?
Yeah,
well, it's not clear.
It varies a lot depending on which messenger and when you look at kind of the announcements. So there's been a wide range of increases, but definitely it's higher than.
Okay, so tell us so you found that consumers expect these tariffs to be put in place, and presumably they expect them to last. That's what you're saying. They expect them to be put in place for the duration of the administration, or what did you ask and what did you find?
We've been running surveys on what's called the Nielsen panel since 2018. The way to think about it, it's a panel of like 50,000 Americans that in terms of like demographics are as representative as you can think. And like one of the nice features of this panel is that given the large size, you also have many survey participants that in fact have managerial duties like, hiring people, setting prices, making investment decisions. And so like we can actually shed light on like what people expect to happen, not only from a workers and consumers perspective, but also through the lens of a managerial or firm perspective. And so like what we did see in the survey was that, especially consumers, as we discussed, like expect this pretty stark increase in tariffs. And they just don't want to kind of wait for it to happen. But in fact, actually, they already took preemptive actions because they indeed seem to actually anticipate that tariffs will go up. And as a response, they started to stockpile goods that are kind of like of higher value, in particular from countries where they expect the biggest increases in taxes or tariffs. Will come to the similarity with taxes, I guess, in a little bit. And you also see in particular that they already kind of started to kind of increase savings in liquid form, so they hold more money in cash, so engage in precautionary behavior. And I think, what's also certainly quite noticeable in the data, if you ask them, think about a hypothetical increase in tariffs by 20 percentage points, who do you think will share kind of like the burden, or who will pay for like this increase in tariffs? And like maybe contrary to like some of the political announcements we've heard, American consumers expect that the lion's share will be kind of be paid by them. So they expect that 50% of the increase in tariffs will be borne into higher prices consumers face, and roughly, the remaining 50% being split equally between domestic producers and foreign producers.
Which, as you say, is fascinating because a lot of the popular wisdom, either, I guess, some of the White House economic advisors have been saying we won't have an effect on prices, which makes huge assumptions about no retaliation and that kind of thing. And the other one that we've seen, which we were talking about before we started recording, was the sort of popular myth, or not myth, but popular narrative, let's put it like that, that most people who voted for Trump didn't really understand what tariffs are, how they work. They sort of think that somehow China will pay tariffs or Mexico will pay tariffs and not US consumers. What I found fascinating about your research is that it actually shows that voters are a lot more savvy than those narratives suggest, right?
Certainly there are consumers in the survey that think that the biggest chunk of the increase in tariffs will be borne by foreign producers. But on average, actually, that's not the case. We really see quite stark in the data that, people really think that prices of goods will increase. And not only actually of goods imported from countries that will actually face potentially higher tariffs, but also domestically produced goods. And the rationale is actually pretty straightforward and simple. If I now face as a domestic producer lower competition because like my foreign competitors face higher tariffs, what happens effectively, I have a higher degree of pricing power. And of course, like firms will take advantage of that, but partially also they need to because, even if I produce domestically here, let's say in Illinois, like I will not have everything produced here, but I will also need to import part of my intermediate inputs for production. They will become more expensive. My costs go up. I have higher pricing power. Of course, I will pass on the increase in my input costs into output prices. So like, even if like tariffs would indeed be very, very effective in the sense that Trump hopes for, that, we increase domestic production, we kind of like import less from abroad, it will still actually lead to an increase in inflation domestically, because even like in such a hypothetical and very extreme scenario, you would still see that domestic producers will increase their prices.
And you're saying they might increase their prices because components have become more expensive, but they might increase them just because they have the opportunity to.
Exactly. Less competition means higher pricing power.
I want to understand what you think the effect is. So consumers are stockpiling cash, it sounds like. They're stockpiling goods, particularly from countries? And what kind of thing are we talking about there? Do you have a sense of that from your survey?
Yeah, consumer electronics, storables, like anything you can think of, like, on the one hand, doesn't kind of get bad overnight, but also like, especially coming from countries where we, at least consumers expect the highest tariffs, like goods imported from China. So like, those are the type of goods. Also like, clothes certainly is among the goods that people seem to be stockpiling already.
And they're specifically doing that because they expect tariffs, not because of some feel-good, reaction to the Trump election like we've seen, and the stock market is generally traded up. People generally feel like there's going to be, lower taxes, so they might feel exuberant, but it's not that.
The stockpiling behavior is especially kind of prevalent among survey participants that self-identify as supporting the Democratic Party, which I would be surprised that they feel especially good. If you look at the Michigan survey data, like, those are tend to be consumers that kind of like, in simplified terms, we are a bit depressed now. And they see kind of like the economic outlook pretty kind of bad. And they are the ones that do actually the stockpiling. So I don't think it's because of like a consumption wealth effect, because now stock markets have done so well, maybe, absent today.
I'm interested in your view on what the aggregate economic effect is. If you're saying that companies are sort of holding off because they're waiting to see what happens with tariffs and presumably the effect that will have on their components and supply chains, and at the same time consumers are spending more now, what is the sort of aggregate effect of that? Does it all kind of wash out, or what do you think is the effect of this hoarding on the economy?
If you think about it, if it's not really the case that consumers go out and start kind of stockpiling, and we don't see in the short run a big increase in the supply of goods at the same time, because firms anticipate higher kind of costs in the future, they already start increasing prices today. What we will see is actually that, the persistence in inflationary pressures, which we've seen over the last 2 years, will just keep actually going up, which of course then also means that the Federal Reserve is in actually a really tough spot. On the one hand, you see kind of heightened pressure coming from the White House on lowering interest rates, but at the same time, many of the policies that are implemented by the White House, if anything, actually increase inflationary pressure. So like, taking those two pieces together, I would expect that, we will see less cuts in interest rates that people were thinking maybe even like at the end of last year because of the heightened inflationary pressure based on consumers' behavior. But of course also based on like other policies that we might potentially see happening pretty soon. If you think about like the US economy, the labor market is already pretty tight. Then you potentially remove millions of workers from the labor market, making the kind of labor market even tighter.
Talking about the immigration policies there.
Exactly, paired with what we discussed earlier, that like firms will have increased pricing power, given that, of course it's great for American workers, their wages will go up. But that, of course, means that the cost of production for many firms, especially in the service sector, keep rising, where the share of the wage bill is pretty high. They will, of course, then pass through their increased cost of production because of higher wages, again, into output prices, putting additional upward pressure on inflation. And so, like, I would say the Fed is in a really tough spot, and we should see potentially quite a bit of upward pressure on inflation dynamics.
If there's pressure on inflation, and we don't know whether the tariffs are really going at the time of recording, whether the big tariffs, the ones on Mexico, Canada, and China, are really going to go ahead. I mean, it sounds like this effect is happening regardless of whether the tariffs happen or not. So we may see inflation regardless of policy.
No, totally. So, like, at least what firms and households say in the survey, they already did take actions. Firms clearly said because they anticipate an increase in tariffs, and because of that higher costs, partially because the cost of inputs will go up, partially because they need to realign their supply chain, which is just maybe too much economic talk to say like we need to buy stuff from somewhere else but China. Because of that, they will have to pay higher costs, and they already take actions now. Maybe now going back to a little bit kind of like economics theory, if you know that you can only increase your prices in a staggered fashion every couple of months, and you have an opportunity now, you take already actions if you think in the future your costs will be higher. So even though we might never see an increase in tariffs and the increases in input costs we're discussing might not even actually materialize. Kind of part of the damage is already done because firms already take action.
How quickly, so when did you do your survey and how quickly could we expect to see, are we already seeing it?
So we did the survey starting in the second half of December of last year until the first week of this year. And, a third of firms said they already started increasing prices. So I think, next reading of the CPI and the PPI data, we'll definitely already kind of see part of like the anticipation of Trump's tariffs policies taking effect.
If you're enjoying this podcast, there's another University of Chicago podcast network show that you should check out. It's called Entitled, and it's about human rights. Co-hosted by lawyers and law professors Claudia Flores and Tom Ginsberg, Entitled explores the stories around why rights matter and what's the matter with rights. Okay, Michael Weber, in the first half of the episode we talked about the tariffs and how inflation is coming, whether there's tariffs or not, which is pretty scary. Is this, if there are tariffs, do they effectively work as a tax increase for U.S. consumers? And if so, does that mean that consumers are just doing what they would normally do ahead of a telegraphed tax increase? We know there's a tax increase coming in 6 months' time. We spend today. Is that sort of particularly, perfectly rational behavior you would expect?
No, that's definitely like another great question, Hal. So like, as we discussed in the first half already to some extent, naturally we should expect the prices of goods coming from abroad to go up. But for the reasons we also mentioned already previously, even the goods that are produced domestically, we would expect like to become more expensive. Now, of course, what that means, it's effectively as if we had like a national sales tax, and that sales tax is going up. So like now in the US, of course, we do not have a sales tax, but in many other countries, including many of the European countries, there's like the value added tax. And in some previous research, actually, we did study what happened in my home country, Germany, when Angela Merkel took the chancellorship in 2005. And when she became chancellor in November 2005, she pre-announced that 14 months later, she would increase the value-added tax from 15 to 18 percentage points. What did consumers do in Germany at the time? Well, you ask them, what do you think will happen to prices? They were anticipating a broad-based increase in inflation across the board. If you looked at what they say, what do you plan to do? They were saying like, I plan to buy larger ticket items. Germans, of course, they love their cars. They started going out to purchase new cars all the way up until December of 2006, when you saw actually like real durable and non-durable consumption growth going through the roof. January of 2007, taxes actually started to be higher and actually consumption started to plummet. In that sense, like, we would expect that something very similar, like, might materialize in the US. Part of it we already see happening, and potentially once we actually see an increase in tariffs, even economic output, we should also be concerned that growth will just be lower because of that effective increase in taxes.
I see. So you're saying that there will be an increase in taxes, but there might be a decrease in consumption?
Once actually the increase is in effect, indeed, yes. Right now, beforehand, people start stockpiling, spend before it's effective. And then once it's in effect, most likely we should see.
Well, does that mean that the increase in prices won't last?
That's a great point. So, like, if consumer demand is lower, then of course, like, you would expect that prices potentially would also be lower. Now, it's ultimately a question of what happens to the cost of production and who is ultimately then bearing the tariffs. But, there's maybe too much of forecasting on my behalf. So, like, that's something we'll need to keep studying, indeed.
Okay. But, again, it's interesting that the consumers are not fooled. They know that a tariff is effectively a tax.
Indeed, yes. They totally understand that. And while you definitely sometimes, see on social media that, some people are surprised that maybe, to maybe use the language that was used in the kind of previous election campaigns, like that China would pay for it. Most consumers are aware that they will need to pay a big chunk.
Right. And interestingly, tariff is, as we said, is Trump's favorite word, apparently, but tax is certainly not. So, the fact that consumers equate the two is kind of interesting. And digging into your survey, you looked at Democrats' voters' attitude versus Republicans, and no surprise that they are on opposite sides when it comes to tariffs, and Democrats oppose them. But Republicans aren't really excited in your survey about tariffs, are they?
Yeah, no, so it's definitely the case that, even among Republicans, the support for kind of tariffs is not uniform. But if you look on average, you see that Republicans support tariffs about, twice as much as Democrats. But as I mentioned, even many Republicans are not very favorable of higher tariffs. But, you definitely do see that that's again, almost bipartisan. Both Democrats and Republicans do expect that domestic production will go up, and in particular, the pass-through of higher tariffs into domestic production, at least when kind of benchmarked against kind of historical empirical evidence, seems to be kind of quite on the high side. So definitely they expect a way higher increase in domestic production than what most economists are anticipating. And, those increases in domestic production will be, of course, very focused in certain industries, whereas kind of the increase in prices will likely be across the board. And so, a few might benefit, whereas the big chunk of the population, they will actually suffer because of higher price levels that we'll see going forward if Trump follows through with the policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's kind of interesting in itself, because I guess, sometimes there were surveys, would you pay higher taxes if, there were universal health care or whatever? And many Democrats would say, yes, they would be prepared to pay higher taxes. I wonder if, given that Republican voters see that tariffs are effectively taxes, is it possible that they might say, well, I don't mind paying a bit more to, first of all, equalize or make fairer whatever they perceive to be our trade policy, and second, to, as you say, to increase American industry, to make American jobs that's worth paying tariffs for. I don't know. Is that possible?
It's certainly a possibility. At the same time, one of the big reasons why I think, we see Trump back in the White House is certainly the experience of many ordinary Americans with price developments in the most recent 2 years. And so, I would be a little bit cautious in, saying that Republicans fully understand that, we need to pay a price for having an increased domestic production. At least from my looking at the data, they might kind of over-perceive the benefits and partially underestimate the costs in terms of higher prices. And, maybe we keep seeing strong domestic growth going forward, and maybe then kind of a kind of counterfactual dip of 0.2 percentage points in growth because of higher tariffs, no one will notice. That's, of course, really hard to say, but, maybe they're just saying, that's part of the price I'm paying for having ultimately my preferred candidate back as president of the U.S., indeed.
Right. I mean, in a similar way, I was just thinking that most economists don't like tariffs, right? But there also has been, in the past decade and more, a lot of serious academic research by very prominent people documenting the so-called China shock, right? The loss of well-paying middle-class industrial jobs because of trade with China. And so, as you say, this survey shows people feel that these tariffs will have a big effect on domestic production, maybe bigger than economists think. But there's a trade-off there, isn't there, at least in the mind of voters, between jobs and inflation. And I'm just saying maybe they're prepared to trade off a little bit of inflation to create more industry.
Totally. So, I definitely see that consumers totally have this in mind, that they think that ultimately, we need to pay a little bit of a higher price for a kind of increased domestic production. Now, again, I just think that they are overestimating the benefits of such a policy and maybe underestimating the costs, because as we discussed in the first half, with an already pretty tight labor market, firms having increased pricing power, if indeed we see higher tariffs because of lack of competition, what will happen will, of course, we see wages of American workers going up. That's, of course, a great thing. But, of course, that just means that the costs of firms go up, and they will have an easier way of passing through those higher costs into prices. And so because of that mechanism, and the potential, what we sometimes refer to as wage price spiral effect, we should see actually a larger increase in inflation, second round effects because of like the price pressure due to higher wages. And that seems to be, at least at the moment, not fully on the radar of most of our participants in the survey. But again, who are we to judge as economists? Sometimes we have to be a bit more humble and maybe look at what consumers think. And ultimately, they are the electorate, and they decide on who is kind of in the White House and which policies are implemented. As you alluded to earlier, like, the American electorate is certainly not as naive, not thinking that, ultimately they will face higher costs. The question is, how much higher will be prices? And our job as economists is ultimately measurement and, to some extent, education.
Okay, and you referred in the first half to, inflation, it sounds like, is coming, regardless of what happens. It's just a question of how much inflation. And if there are tariffs, it's going to be worse than if there aren't. But it's interesting you referred to the Fed, and I think a lot of people are expecting there might be a confrontation between the administration and the Fed, because obviously the administration, it sounds like, is going to create inflation, even though it says it's not going to, which it could then easily blame on the Fed. And the Fed will presumably be trying to control inflation by pushing up interest rates, which will damage the stock market and other things that Trump really cares about. So do you anticipate that this is going to happen, this confrontation between the Fed and the Trump administration? And how will it play out, do you think?
No, definitely. And we already saw Jay Powell in one of the more recent press conferences directly saying that, he checked with his lawyers. There's no way Trump could actually get rid of him. And so, certainly the Fed is really concerned about political pressure. And, the Fed is rightly concerned about it because, as we already saw in the previous Trump presidency, he has, at the time, regularly used Twitter to put pressure on the Federal Reserve, and actually does have an effect on the perception of the public on whether they think the Fed is kind of like neutral, bipartisan, and so in some other recent work, we actually documented. We had first done this in April of last year, where we did a survey, the perceived political bias of the Federal Reserve. And at the time, Republicans thought that the Fed is Democratic-leaning, whereas Democrats also thought actually it's way more Republican-leaning. We had an hypothetical in the survey.
That's good, right? If both think that it's the other...
No, exactly.
It's the other side. That's what it should be.
But so we also had what do you think happens under a scenario that Trump gets elected? And both Republicans and Democrats stated the Fed will be way more Republican-leaning. Now, what we did on January 20th, we had a new survey in the field to see whether kind of actual perception line up with the hypotheticals from April of last year. And that's what you see. You do see now that both Republicans and Democrats think that the Fed going forward will actually be way more Republican-leaning. They also kind of have now a very kind of bipartisan, a very dichotomous, polarized view in terms of trust in the Federal Reserve to kind of care about price stability. Many Democrats think now, the Fed will ultimately maybe not hike sufficiently to keep inflation in check, which of course, all the distributional impacts of inflation on especially hurting lower income Americans, that's now way beyond, of course, the scope of our conversation. But, it's definitely I see many concerns and red flags going forward that there will be a fight between the Federal Reserve and the White House in terms of appropriate policies going forward. The Fed caring about its dual mandate and price stability in particular, whereas the White House, I think at some point, as Trump famously said, that he's a low interest rate person, certainly pushing for the Fed to keep cutting interest rates.
Well, as you say, there's a too big a conversation to have now, Michael, but hopefully we can have you back. Michael Weber, thank you very much for coming on the Chicago Booth Review podcast.
Pleasure was mine. Thanks a lot, Hal.
That's it for this episode of the Chicago Booth Review podcast, part of the University of Chicago Podcast Network. For more research, analysis, and insights, visit our website at chicagobooth.edu/review. When you're there, sign up for our weekly newsletter so you never miss the latest in business-focused academic research. This episode was produced by Josh Stunkel. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and please do leave us a 5-star review. Until next time, I'm Hal Weitzman. Thanks for listening.